Hello, everyone. Today we are together for another interview. We have Mr. Andrew Day from the American Conservative. Hello, sir. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Firstly, we appreciate you having time for us. And obviously, the subject itself is the Iran war. It has it has passed more than a month at this point that the war is going on. The whole subject was, if we listen to what President Trump said yesterday, the war itself was expected to be 3 days long and not more longer than that. But at this
hmm
point, we don't have a ending at sight, and the president himself said that 2 or 3 more weeks of hostilities are expected. But in the same time, there is a massive expectation of how the war will go on from this point, especially for this weekend. There was a build-up by the American Marines and the airborne troops in the Middle East. Now there's another aircraft carriers heading towards the Middle East. Within all this perspective, firstly, I want to start with the closest subject at hand. Do you think that the amphibious assault is going to happen this weekend, like many expect to do?
Oh man, now I'm in the position of trying to predict what Donald Trump is going to do. I'm not sure even he knows, so it's quite difficult to predict. I mean, you mentioned, and it was very interesting that Donald Trump said yesterday that he had predicted the war would last for 3 days. I don't think that those comments were supposed to air, and most people here in DC think the White House only accidentally aired those because they made the comments private afterwards, but someone downloaded the video and was able to release it on Twitter. Because
Oh,
previously we didn't know that he had predicted such a short war, although there had been reports that he or the White House had communicated to Turkey and to Gulf Arab partners that the war would last for 4 days. So apparently Trump had actually thought it would be even shorter than that. And as you mentioned, the war has on for longer than a month. While I was very confidently predicting that there would be a war, back in early February and then before the 12-day war last year, I'm a little hesitant to make strong predictions now because once you start the war, Trump has rolled the dice. He loses control, even though he sees himself as the author of the war and he wanted to do these decisive opening strikes. Once you're in this escalation trap, really, you've kind of opened Pandora's box and it's not so much in your control. And so I don't know exactly what the next step will be. I do think that Trump probably will want to put some sort of punctuation mark on the war so that he could get out. I do think he wants to get out and doesn't really know how. And so maybe that punctuation mark could be some sort of ground force invasion, although it seems quite risky to me. A lot of the ground operations that we're hearing about sound to me like suicide missions, and it's not clear that they have any real strategic rationale. So seizing Carrick Island, senators like, Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the most hawkish voices among American lawmakers, has been saying that if we seize Carrick Island, then Iran is going to collapse because they depend on it as an oil terminal. That's not true. I assume that Trump has wiser voices in his ear saying that that's not true. So it does seem like the most likely ground operation would be one to secure uranium. But it sounds extremely risky because one, we don't know exactly where the uranium is. I mean, I'm sure our U.S. intelligence agencies have a better idea than I do, but I don't think that they have a better idea than Tehran does. So Tehran probably has a better sense of where the highly enriched uranium is than we do. They might have booby trapped it. It's going to be difficult to get our airborne infantry, our special ops in there. They're going to have to secure a perimeter. So it's not just going to be special ops that are involved. And these things are heavy. It's like 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium. Those things come in these like steel containers. So the overall weight's going to be higher than that. And then how the heck do you get it out of there? I mean, one idea is that our troops would literally have to build like a makeshift runway to have to fly the stuff out of there in a plane. That to me sounds like a nightmare, and it's kind of hard to imagine Trump authorizing it. So my best guess is that they're moving troops, Marines, special ops into the region to give Trump options, but actually all of the options are really bad. So I hesitate to predict that we're actually going to see him authorize one of them.
mhm. Thank you. Well, now we can go back to the beginning of the war. There were a lot of claims on why Donald Trump and Trump administration in general wanted to start this war. When you look into the overall justifications that Trump has put, it's almost changing on an hourly basis at this point. At one point, he talks about the enriched uranium in the hands of the Iranians, which could lead into a nuclear weapon. And then he talks about the ballistic missiles. Then he talks about the protesters being killed. Then even Pete Hegseth claimed that the assassination attempt on Trump's life was done by the Iranians, and the group who was responsible of that was taken out. So there are a lot of justifications has been put by the Trump administration, but we don't really understand which one is the right one. Why do you think that Trump administration decided to attack Iran?
I think it's a jumble, as you just laid out. So I don't think even the Trump administration can really tell a coherent story about why they did this. And as you mentioned, they have been unable to tell a coherent story, and all of their reasons continually change. And of course, they kind of adapt the, retrospectively, the reasoning that motivated the war in order to fit what has actually been accomplished in the war. So now, they clearly haven't overthrown the regime, even after killing Ayatollah Khomeini. So if that was part of the justification for war, now they'll either say, oh, that actually wasn't, one reason that we went to war, or actually we had a non-ambitious understanding of regime change, so we basically already accomplished it, even though any international relations analyst would say this is not regime change. The Islamic Republic is still there. It's a personnel change because they've killed a lot of leaders. So I think, one reason was to degrade Iran. I mean, America has had tense relations with Iran, obviously, since the revolution in 79. Trump is a boomer. Boomers have a kind of Cold War mentality where they don't like, authoritarian, non-liberal democracies. They don't trust them. But I do think that the Israel, issue is unavoidable. Like, Israel is a part of the story. You can't tell the story about Trump's decision to go to war without talking about Israel and its American lobby in the United States. I mean, I talked a couple weeks ago to Joe Kent, who resigned from the Counterterrorism Center. He was the director of that, and he said in his letter while resigning that this war is not in American interests, and the reason we went to war is because Israel and its American lobby were pushing for it. And the reporting from outlets like the New York Times even corroborates that. They say that Benjamin Netanyahu was relentless behind the scenes in pushing for this war. That's consistent with my own reporting from the run up to the 12-day war, when I think Trump genuinely wanted to get a nuclear deal with Iran. And, in February and most of March, it seemed like that negotiation was going reasonably well and it had a decent chance of success. And then there was this turn where they were pushing for no uranium enrichment and maybe even reducing the range of Iranian missiles. And these things were total non-starters for Iran, which is why they started talking about that, because Israeli interests started to predominate in that conversation, because Israel, maybe they don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. They definitely share that with the United States, that goal. But they have this other goal where they want to achieve a kind of regional hegemony, and Iran is an obstacle in their path to regional hegemony. And I think that the Israelis have a very focused strategic vision of what they want to achieve. I think the White House, as led by Donald Trump, at least in the case of the Iran war, does not have any kind of strategic vision about what it wants to achieve. And so, because of this special relationship between the US and Israel, that has amounted to us waging a war on Israel's behalf.
Uh-huh. Well, it's good that you mentioned Joe Kent. I want to ask you about him, but before that, the Israel's participation in U.S. politics, if I may, is a source of discussion in all around the world at this point, considering how much it affects the Middle East, their policies regarding Europe, and pretty much everything. But maybe this is the first conflict in the history of United States that the main public argument right now is that United States has been pushed into this conflict by Israel. It didn't happen in Iraq. It didn't happen in Vietnam. It didn't happen in any other conflict. So this is the first time that it happened. How do you think it's going to affect the relation between Israel and United States aftermath of this war? Do you think that it's going to boost the skepticism towards Israel in U.S. politics in general?
I definitely do. And this is a somewhat complicated question and issue with a lot of moving parts and kind of mutual causality because, Americans were growing more skeptical of Israel, less favorable toward Israel in public opinion polls since even before the war on Gaza after the October 7th attacks. But the war on Gaza accelerated that change in public opinion, not just in America, but even in Europe and Canada, basically across the Western world. Um, and I think that this is a similar thing where, you know, already the trend line suggested that Israel was becoming much less popular among Americans. I mean, Democratic voters basically don't like Israel at all. And even half of Republicans under the age of 50 say that they have an unfavorable view of Israel. And a minority of them still have a favorable view of Israel. So there's been a really stunning transformation in US public opinion on the issue of Israel. There is a stark generational divide where boomers are still very, for the most part, supportive of Israel, and young people, conservatives and liberals, are not. Um, so I think that the Iran war definitely will accelerate that process for the reasons you laid out, because this is a topic of public interest and public debate, and people recognize the role of Israel in pushing for this war, although that doesn't absolve President Donald Trump of his responsibility for launching it. At the same time, it's because of that changing public opinion that Israel was pushing so strongly for this war, because they know that our support for them, and the U.S. is the superpower patron of Israel. I mean, Israel wouldn't be able to do any of this without American support. You know, they wouldn't dare to attack Iran if we didn't promise to extend our superpower shield over Israel, and they couldn't possibly wage an attempted regime change war against Iran without American offensive involvement. And so they know that a day is coming when they're going to have to detox from U.S. military assistance. And so they know that now is the time that they have to move on Iran. And that's why they're pushing so strong for this. So it's a kind of complicated story. I do think that the war is going to accelerate the turn against Israel in America, but Israel is kind of getting the last thing that it wanted, that it needed U.S. security assistance for.
Mhm. Well, when you look into the Trump administration in general or the MAGA movement, you're seeing a picture where there was at first a little civil war between the old school Republicans, the more pro-establishment types, and then there was the MAGA. But now, especially with the divide that come with the Israel situation, there is even a divide in itself where the MAGA has a pro-Israel and America first groups. At least that's how most of us read it like. So when you look into who has Trump's ear, there are a lot of names that we can talk about, like his son-in-law Jared Kushner. Then you would have Laura Loomer. You would have the maybe the one in White House, Stephen Miller. There's a lot of figures in around Trump that is strictly pro-Israel and could push him towards that direction. But in the other hand, you have the other side of the MAGA, which could include J.D. Vance, Steve Bannon, and many other figures. Do you see them as being on the second circle rather than the first circle around Trump? Because it looks like the policies that's been pushed by the first circle, by the pro-Israel crowd, is winning right now. What do you say about this?
I mean, the pro-Israel crowd definitely is winning right now, and Trump is listening to them a lot more than he's listening to Tucker Carlson, as evidenced by the fact that he just launched a war with Iran. And Tucker Carlson, I believe you didn't mention his name, but I think he's the most important figure when we're talking about anti-Iran war MAGA
Mm-hmm.
conservatives. You mentioned Stephen Miller. I wouldn't emphasize his role in pushing for the Iran war. He focuses more on domestic policy, and I actually get the sense that he probably doesn't like this war and didn't want it to happen because it distracts from the
He didn't?
immigration agenda, and it's very dangerous politically for Trump, and he's a political advisor, so he recognizes this kind of thing. I may be wrong about that, but the decision-making circle around Trump within the White House on the Iran war is basically Pete Hegseth, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and possibly Susie Wiles, although she happens to be dealing with breast cancer right now, but I think she was in the room also when they were deciding whether to go to war. And as far as people on
What
the
about
outs
Lindsey Graham?
yeah, Lindsey Graham. When you're talking about people on the outside of the White House, he's maybe the first name that comes to mind, which is really stunning because Trump made a name for himself in 2016 on the campaign trail by taking on the neoconservatives, taking on the establishment, blasting them, condemning them for these forever wars, in particular the war in Iraq. And Senator Lindsey Graham, after the death of John McCain, is probably the single most hawkish person in Congress. So Lindsey Graham seems to be getting what he wants from Trump. Another figure worth mentioning is Mark Levin of Fox News. He definitely has had Trump's ear. Trump is telling his supporters on Truth Social to go listen to Mark Levin's totally insane rants about the Iran war, in which Mark Levin will have one Mark Thiessen, who is a former speechwriter for the George W. Bush administration, and they're talking about the need to go get the uranium and to do this crazy mission that I was describing earlier. So that's very concerning that he's listening to people like that. Laura Loomer is an apparent sociopath. She should have no role in our politics, but unfortunately, she also does have some influence in the White House. Although I think people in the White House kind of recognize that she's a bit of a weirdo. As far as the broader MAGA divide, I think this is really dangerous, and I think it goes down to the grassroots. I mean, it looks like Trump has support. When a pollster asks whether you are MAGA, respondents hear that as, do you support Donald Trump? And so if they support Donald Trump and everything he does, they say, yes, I'm MAGA. So that's why it looks like there's 100% MAGA support or thereabouts for the Iran war. But actually, even that has been declining, where MAGA in the most recent poll has about a 79% approval for the Iran war. Republicans in general have a 62% approval for the Iran war. And overall, Americans have 28% approval because a lot of, like almost all Democrats and a lot of independents, a strong majority of independents, are skeptical of the war. If you think of MAGA as people who say I'm MAGA, which is only about 15% of the population, or if you think of MAGA as a Trump personality cult, then there's no divide. But if you think of MAGA as a coalition that has won twice presidential elections and that could survive Trump and win more elections in the future, which requires a coalition that includes traditional Republicans and also independents, then MAGA is dead. I mean, the Iran war marks the end of MAGA, in my opinion. I don't think that they're going to be able to assemble another coalition like Trump did, because this totally discredits right-wing populism. Unfortunately, it discredits the Republican Party, because now the Republican Party appears to be the party that wants to cut taxes for rich people and wage wars in the Middle East. Those things are not popular in America. So people thought, well, maybe Trump is something different than George W. Bush. He's a different kind of Republican, so their Republican brand was different, and this ruins all of that. And now Trump is talking about how his midterm pitch, the midterms are coming up, the elections in Congress. His pitch is apparently going to be, we have to grow the defense budget and we have to reduce the budget for domestic programs like healthcare. This is not a political winner. This is a disastrous political messaging campaign, and it might be a necessary one if they're going to fund this Iran war, which is getting very expensive.
Mm-hmm. Well, I left the Tucker Carlson situation for another question because I thought that it deserves its own part. So Mr. Carlson has become a famous figure in all of the internet, all of the media. Even in Turkey, he is being spoken about a lot at this point. But we are not sure how much of that really reflects on the American public. Because when you listen to especially more pro-Israel voices, they're always claiming that the Tucker Carlson's popularity is coming from internet, and in real life it doesn't really have something similar going on. And there are some polls which, when you check about it, it's really to a certain extent, it looks niche, like in 15 to 20%, maybe 25% of popularity in some polls. So what do you think about it, especially for a 2028 elections? Is it possible for Tucker Carlson to emerge as a political figure in the conservative movement?
Yeah, and first, a little thing came on my screen saying recording error. So I don't know if there's something that you should address.
I think it's continuing right now.
Okay. So yeah, in some sense, Tucker Carlson and podcasts in general are pretty niche because most Americans are not actually politically engaged. So that suggests that, a lot more people know about Trump and the other Republican lawmakers than they do about podcasters. On the other hand, I think that the direction of the Iran war is such that it will clearly become a catastrophe, even to people who are not very politically engaged, in part just because of rising gas prices. And the American economy and transportation system is very oil intensive. So an oil shock is going to hurt Americans severely, especially if this war continues and that oil shock gets worse and worse. And so people like Tucker Carlson and Joe Kent are going to seem vindicated, just like critics of the Iraq war seemed vindicated after that war became very unpopular. Um, so right now, Tucker Carlson is niche. Most people aren't just like listening to podcasts or like plugged in 24/7 to politics. But to the extent Americans are paying attention, they seem very wary of this war. Even Republicans who say that they support the war are wary of rising gas prices and the possibility of ground forces. Only, I think, about 7% of Americans support putting ground forces into Iran. So if Trump does that, some support will go up among MAGA people who support Trump no matter what he does, but the broader support for this war is going to decrease even lower than what it is currently. And so that positions Tucker Carlson as someone who was right from the beginning when the war began. And I think he could be in a good position if he wanted to enter into politics as a candidate, perhaps. He does have name recognition. And as I said, I think he's going to look better in the eyes of most people after this Iran war is over.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about Joe Kent. So you took him to a podcast last week, I think, and it was I mean, Joe Kent is a figure that has all the eyes on him right now, especially after leaving Trump administration. It has become a discussion that many more figures may follow inside the Trump cabinet or even on the broader like Pentagon or intelligence community. If you ask to Laura Loomer, she was giving a quote unquote scoop that Tulsi Gabbard could be following Joe Kent on the resignation, that she may leave the cabinet for good. So, do you think that there will be more resignations to follow?
Yeah, so I talked to Joe Kent on our podcast along with my co-host at the American Conservative 2 weeks ago, actually, and it was only 3 days after he resigned.
Mm.
And that resignation, we should say, was a really stunning moment. I mean, we had some resignations from the State Department, including by people I know, during the Biden administration over the Gaza war, but this was a senior official. This was the head of counterterrorism efforts in the United States government. And I don't know of any precedent for such a senior official resigning, and especially not in this way, where they released this letter, public letter addressed to the president, in which they say that this war is not only bad news, but it is being waged on Israel's behalf and as a result of Israeli pressure. So I definitely think the Trump administration was worried about that. I mean, they came after him and said that he was under investigation for leaking classified information. That is almost certainly not true because they would not have left him in that position as head of counterterrorism, which, of course, such a position grants you access to all sorts of classified information. They wouldn't have left him in that position if they actually thought that he was guilty of leaking classified intelligence, right? Um, so they were clearly worried and they wanted to slander him, demonize him, discredit him. It didn't work, in my opinion. Believe that investigation has even come to an end. And one reason they were doing that, we can infer, is that they were worried about other high profile resignations. Attention immediately went to Tulsi Gabbard because she has also, like Joe Kent, developed a reputation as being more aligned with MAGA, and even more than Joe Kent, has developed a reputation for being anti war. Joe Kent's views on these matters actually changed. I asked him about it on the podcast, and he said it was as a result of his experience in the White House that he started to realize how serious the problem is of Israeli influence on our foreign policy. Tulsi Gabbard was already primed to care about such a thing, although I don't think she's been a big Israel critic in the past. But she has been someone who was skeptical of our foreign wars openly, and even willing to question official narratives on, like, Syria, for example. I mean, I know that Turkish audience, I don't know how they would feel about her own skepticism on the subject. It's a very complicated subject, but it's worth noting. She had a view on that was different from what the pro-Israel people were saying. So, right now there is some murmuring that she's on the chopping block, that Trump might fire her. I guess it's not out of the question that she could resign in advance of that to kind of tell her story in her own way rather than being fired. And just generally, I think that as this war becomes unpopular, as it drags the White House down, there is a danger for the White House that more and more figures are going to resign because they don't want the reputational damage that's going to be associated with this war.
Then there is the J.D. Vance situation. J.D. Vance is the obvious contestant for the 2028 elections. Many even call that they're going to race with Marco Rubio for that spot. And especially with the Venezuela situation, there was a general expectation of little rivalry coming out between these two figures. More pro-establishment types supporting Marco Rubio, and more mega types would support J.D. Vance. And even some media organizations were claiming that Trump is more happy with Marco Rubio rather than J.D. Vance. So this situation obviously become a stain on J.D. Vance because he was advocating for exact opposite of what happened with Iran, and his own supporters would be in a tougher spot. Donald Trump is capable of pushing against that because his leadership skills is at a different level, but J.D. Vance is pretty new when it comes to that. So how do you see J.D. Vance's chances in 2028 election race?
I think this is a disaster for J.D. Vance politically, and he's very much exposed. I mean, as you say, he was associated with those who favor a more restrained U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, and it's very difficult for J.D. Vance to tell the story about himself that he had been telling previously, which is that he was a veteran of the forever wars, the war on terrorism, and he became, skeptical of those wars and hostile to the establishment who was sending American troops into war zones for reasons seemingly unconnected to American interests. I don't know how he really tells that story now. As far as his rivalry with Marco Rubio, they claim to be friends behind the scene. The rivalry hasn't really bubbled up in a public way, but we can definitely see that they're appealing to different factions and that the rivalry is kind of objectively there, whether they recognize or admit it is there. Um, J.D. Vance is interesting because actually, before the war, he wasn't a big, and before joining the White House, he wasn't a big Israel critic. He actually gave a speech at an event co-hosted by the American Conservative in 2024, in which he explained why he supported Israel and saw them as there was a cultural affinity between Americans and Israelis, he said, and Israel was our ally in the Middle East, and so we should support them in this kind of thing. Over the course of the Trump administration, as it's become very obvious that the skepticism of Israel exists even on the American right in a major way, he's changed his tune a little bit. He's started to say things more like, well, the US and Israel are different countries. Sometimes their interests overlap, sometimes their interests diverge. And when their interests diverge, America should go its own way and Israel can go its own way too. So this war is undoubtedly very awkward for him. And I do think that the way that he and Marco Rubio are approaching it suggests that J.D. Vance is much more uncomfortable and kind of privately opposed to the war than Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is out, you know, trying to raise, public approval for this war, being very aggressive rhetorically, while JD Vance has been kind of hiding, right? I mean, he can't hide continually 24/7. Sometimes he's in the room and he's asked about the
Yeah.
Iran war, and he has to, of course, support the administration's foreign policy. But even Trump has admitted there was a philosophical difference, as Trump put it, between he and JD Vance. So one possibility is that we do get negotiations, peace negotiations. Even the letter that Masoud Pezeshkian, the president of Iran, released yesterday, at the end of it held out some hope for diplomatic engagement. And J.D. Vance, according to reports, is someone that at least mediators in the region are hoping will lead the U.S.-Iran negotiations. And Trump seems willing to let J.D. Vance be part of the negotiating team on this issue. So if J.D. Vance can make some diplomatic gains and actually help end the war, that might be a way for him to kind of evade the political consequences of this war. But personally, I don't really see any reason to suppose that that's going to happen.
Mhm. Well, this is going to be a little less about the war and more about the domestic American politics, but I want to ask you about the Democrat Party. So Democrat Party is in a situation where they lost a crushing defeat against Donald Trump in 2024, and it's really questionable how much they managed to recover from that. There are many figures emerging, more younger figures emerging, like Gavin Newsom. He become a one of the figures that is trying to hype up the crowds in the more liberal groups in the United States. But he made some comments about Israel. He was a bit critical, more critical than anticipated, and then he had to backtrack and apologize for what he said. From this point, in the 2016 elections, it's obviously going to be about Iran war, about economy and everything. But there were certain cultural aspects that the Democratic Party pushed in 2024, which seemed like it caused backlash, especially on immigration and more gender issues. So in 2028, do you think that the Democrats are going to pursue a similar path, or they are going to change their overall rhetoric?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, at first I'll say I don't know how crushing this defeat was in 2028. Sorry, in 2024. I mean, when you look at a map and you look at the change from blue to red districts and blue to red states, it seemed pretty dramatic. And Trump is correct when he brags that he won all of the battleground states that were up for grabs. On the other hand, he didn't quite crack 50% in the popular vote. And indeed, his percentage victory in the popular vote was lower than Hillary Clinton's was when she lost the Electoral College in 2016. So, in another sense, it was quite narrow, and I definitely don't think that the Republicans should be confident. I don't. I was even arguing right after the election that the Republicans were overconfident, and actually they faced some significant headwinds, largely owing to America's demographic change, because non-white voters, minority voters, are much more likely to support the Democratic Party, and white people are kind of split between the parties, although mostly supporting the Republicans. So I think it would have been a difficult situation for the Republicans regardless going forward. I think that the Trump administration is becoming so unpopular that it seems kind of impossible for the Republicans to win in 2028, with the caveat that the Democratic Party actually doesn't have a very good brand right now. People aren't happy with the Trump administration, with President Trump, but neither do they like the Democratic Party. And, on the question of Israel, even though Democratic voters are very critical of Israel, there's still this geriatric political establishment on the Democratic side, right? So Gavin Newsom, you might think, oh, it's obviously in his political interest to be really critical of Israel, and maybe he thought that too, which is why he gave those critical comments on Israel. And I'm sure behind the scenes he got a lot of backlash from donors and such, and so he, as you say, he had to backtrack. So he's trying to figure out how to negotiate this. I would suspect that he would be somewhat middle of the road, maybe more pro-Israel than other figures. I think AOC of California, Congresswoman, is also going to be in the mix, and she'll be more critical of Israel than Gavin Newsom. She's kind of repositioning now to get in that lane. So whoever comes out of the Democratic Party, I think they're going to have a really good chance of winning the presidency, and I think the Democrats are going to do very well in the midterms this year. But there's still going to be some awkwardness surrounding the issue of Israel, and I think a lot of voters are going to be, you know, kind of trying to force the Democrats to give us an option, like an option of a candidate who was willing to just break the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel. But I want to also remind your listeners that, foreign policy, I think, does matter in American politics and American elections more than a lot of political scientists think it does. But at the same time, voters will probably be paying more attention to like affordability,
Hmm.
inflation. And that's another reason to think that the Republican Party is going to have a difficult time, because this Iran war, as I was describing earlier, is causing what we call gasoline prices to go up, and that's going to cause uh, inflation across the board if this war doesn't get wrapped up soon, because 18-wheeler trucks that run on diesel are the ones delivering all of our groceries and commodities. So we'll see a general inflation that's going to be potentially devastating for the Republican Party.
Hmm. When you look into neocons, there is a mixed feeling coming from them right now. In the first days of the war, we have seen John Bolton celebrating its starting. then you would have Jeb Bush congratulating Marco Rubio on everything. So the neocon side of the Republican Party seemed pretty happy, but especially how things emerged from there, their happiness seemed like half, like it's not fully satisfactory to them. Obviously, because the results are not there yet. So, what does this tell to us about Trump administration and how much the neocons have influence over Trump administration? Do you see it as neocons are not being happy in general, or not have enough influence to plan and strategize this properly like they want to? Because John Bolton was specifically talking about the Strait of Hormuz, where he wanted to attack Iran back in the day in the first Trump administration, and Trump decided that it was a terrible idea, and he fired him because of that. So were they a part of the planning in this?
I mean, yeah, definitely. I think that the neoconservative vision has prevailed. I mean, neoconservatism is a specific ideology. It's something general, different than just general hawkism. You know, it has to do with wanting to spread democracy. It's usually focused on Middle Eastern countries, so wanting to spread democracy to the Middle East, in large part because a lot of the non-democratic countries in the Middle East were perceived to be threats to Israel. So understanding that what happened in Iraq was, definitely that was a neoconservative project. John Bolton is an extreme hawk. I don't know if he has the same neoconservative commitment to spreading liberalism and democracy and human rights, supposedly. But in any case, yeah, we could consider him as a neoconservative. And one thing that's been interesting about the Trump administration is that they were trying to or Trump was trying to split the difference and, do these decisive military action, but not go all the way to regime change, right? So in Venezuela, he got Maduro. He basically installed the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, as the president of Maduro, or of Venezuela rather, because she was willing to kind of work with the United States and bend the knee and do what we tell her, basically. But interestingly, the people who favor foreign policy restraint were generally not very happy with that raid. And also the hardcore neocons were not happy with it because they wanted an actual regime change, right? To get rid of the Chavista socialist government in Venezuela and install Machado, this like opposition figure. But Trump didn't do that. I think with Iran, he wanted to do a similar thing, and he thought he could because it worked in Venezuela, because a similar kind of thing worked last year during the 12-day war when he entered with just a quick bombing raid, one-night bombing raid, Operation Midnight Hammer. As we were talking about earlier, he seemed to think that this military operation, as they're calling it, in Iran was only going to last like 3 to 4 days. Obviously, it didn't work out. So the neocons wouldn't have been happy if he had just gone in for a 4-day war and then gotten out. Now that he's gotten sucked in, they definitely want him to go all the way and do regime change. And John Bolton is saying, "Oh, this could be a catastrophe." I mean, John Bolton is not a dumb person. He's his ideology, I think, is kind of lunacy, but he's not an idiot, and he recognizes that, if Trump leaves in 2 weeks, Iran is still, the Islamic Republic is still going to be there. I think we can assume, and it'll rebuild its military capabilities, right? And it's going to be very hostile to the United States and Israel because of what has just happened to it. And so John Bolton's actually getting kind of worried right now. Interestingly, some other neoconservatives are pretty anti-Trump, right? Like Bill Kristol, who was very supportive of the George W. Bush administration. Other never Trumpers, they don't like Trump for a lot of reasons related to domestic politics. They kind of see him as like a quasi-fascist figure. And sometimes they go along with Trump when he's hawkish on foreign policy, but a lot of them, interestingly, are saying, now, hold up, this was a bad idea. George W. Bush didn't attack Iran because, presumably he realized it was extremely risky. And I think that those kinds of figures similarly recognized that this was a bad idea and poorly thought out, and it shouldn't have happened at all. So I do think that what we can call neoconservatism, was part of the story. I think similar to what I was describing as how Israel has a strong strategic vision, these American neoconservatives have a focused strategic vision. And so when they're coming to Trump and they're pumping him up and saying, "Oh, you're the greatest wartime president ever. You're spreading freedom. You're getting rid of all of American adversaries," I think he's very receptive to that, even if when he launches the war, he doesn't quite understand what it's going to entail.
Mhm. Uh, there is the new subject in Israel, in the Israeli media, Israeli politicians or influencers, and even the figure that we just talked about, Laura Loomer. They're claiming that after Iran, their new threat that they have to fight against is Turkey. So in the Turkish public, Turkish media, we are talking about this a lot. Are we under threat? There's the words of Mike Huckabee. He was talking about how Israel could have the entirety of Middle East. They have biblical rights on it. So these type of conversations always, like make us fear what may come in the following years. So when you look into Israel, do you think, especially after the Iran situation have dwindled down, do you think that there will be a conflict brewing between Turkey and Israel?
I do think so. I mean, as I was saying, Israel wants to achieve regional hegemony, and they need the U.S. to have their back in order to do that. I think that this is very unstable. Like, this is not a smart idea, even for Israeli interests, because Americans are turning against Israel. And so we can expect that U.S. security assistance to Israel is going to either decrease or be entirely cut off in the coming years. Um, and it's just not plausible that a country of 10 million people, without the support of the United States, could maintain regional hegemony in a stable way. Um, and it's interesting, they had been seeing Iran as kind of the final boss in their quest for regional hegemony. And now that they've gotten this war, they've kind of realized, oh, wait, Turkey is there too, the second most powerful country in
FDLC.
NATO. Yeah. And so I do think we're going to see some tensions there. I think it would be much more difficult for Israel to get the U.S. to turn against Turkey and certainly to wage a war on Turkey. I mean, that's out of the question because, as I mentioned earlier, America does have tense relations with Iran. Americans know about Iran because of the hostage crisis in '79. And so it's easy to tell Americans that Iran is an enemy of America. And so that's why we have to go after them. Turkey is a totally different story. It's a NATO member, right? Trump has pretty good relations with Erdogan. Um, so I think we're going to see some tensions there. I would expect it to express more as kind of proxy conflicts, like we saw in Syria. But I do think that an American president needs to tell Israel no, go away, because we are heading in this direction where Israel is going to set its sights on Turkey. But as I said, I don't think it's going to play out in the same way. I don't think that Turks should be worried that they're going to be like the next Iran, but they will be the next kind of focus of Israeli attention, and that's not a fun thing to do. I should also mention, I know that just as NATO is a kind of a divisive subject here in America on the American right, I know that there are some people in Turkey who are skeptical of it. And here, at the American Conservative, we can be pretty critical of NATO because we think it kind of enmeshes us in the security situation in Europe, and that Europe should kind of take control of their own security. And also, it's not really good for Europe because America is hardly protecting Europe these days. I mean, we're causing a catastrophe for them right now in Iran. So there are a lot of reasons to criticize NATO, but you should also be mindful that, Israel doesn't like the Western alliance and it doesn't like Turkey's involvement in it. And right now, I think a lot of pro Israel figures in America are trying to get Americans to turn against Europe, to turn against Turkey, definitely. And to create skepticism about NATO that goes different than these normal security concerns that I expressed. And so, if you're critical of NATO, that makes sense. There's a lot of things about NATO that are worth being critical about, but maybe you should also be mindful of this element,
Mhm.
because one thing that's going to make the Turkey situation different than the Iran situation is its membership in NATO.
Yeah. Then one last question about NATO then, because yesterday Donald Trump made pretty solid statements about NATO members. He was pretty critical about UK. He was critical about the whole alliance in general, and he even, for probably for the first time, if I'm not mistaken, he said that he is considering leaving NATO for good. Uh, now a lot of people are trying to understand if this is a possibility. Is there a like a lawful background that Trump could do this? And there was the bill introduced ironically, by Marco Rubio back in the day in 2023 that prevents this. But still, if the will is there, there could be a way. So, what do you think? Do you see this as a bluff against European nations to make them help for the Strait of Hormuz situation, or you see this as a serious political move that can follow up in the next years?
So, if we're talking about formal withdrawal from NATO, the president can't do that unilaterally. And it seems likely that even prior to that Rubio sponsored bill that you mentioned, the president wouldn't have been able to do that unilaterally because this is a treaty, right? So, Congress has ratified it, the Senate has ratified it. And I think most constitutional scholars would say that Congress would need to have some input on leaving that alliance. And then Rubio, with that bill, what it really does, as I understand, is just kind of make explicit and enshrine that in law that this is the situation legally, that the president can't unilaterally withdraw from it. However, President Trump could definitely kind of hollow out NATO, right? I mean, the key component of NATO is the collective defense article. And if Trump is signaling that he doesn't believe in that, that the U.S. wouldn't come to the defense of a NATO member that was attacked, then that it's almost tantamount to U.S. withdrawal from NATO, because it so undermines the credibility of America's commitment. And as we all know, NATO is basically America. Like, America runs NATO. At least that's historically been the case. So, Trump could definitely do a lot of damage to NATO. I know a lot of people on the right-wing side here in America would be fine with that. But I would also point out another way that Trump is damaging NATO, which I don't think that these right-wing pro-restraint people would be fine with, which he wants NATO now to be an aggressive alliance, right? He's saying that these European countries should be joining with us in a war of aggression against Iran. And that's not actually what NATO is supposed to be. And in fact, the perception that NATO was becoming a more aggressive actor was one reason that Putin was so wary of NATO and NATO expansion. And it was one reason that, Putin launched the war in Ukraine. So it's also bad for NATO if people start to think that there's going to be American pressure for it to become this aggressive alliance, right? So the Europeans should definitely say no. They also have to consider Trump is telling them to open the Strait of Hormuz, but clearly the U.S. cannot open the Strait of Hormuz, so it must be quite difficult to do militarily, because America has a much better navy than these European countries do. And so basically, Trump is offering, okay, you go get your own oil by opening the Strait of Hormuz, which we haven't been able to do. And Iran is saying, you become non-hostile to us and you'll get your oil. And I think a lot of Europeans are tempted by that Iranian offer, and that we might actually end up seeing them kind of going along with this toll system and giving Iran sort of sovereignty over the Hormuz Strait, which they had never had prior to this war. So that's one way that this war could really backfire quite magnificently. Also, these European countries when they're looking at these Arab Gulf countries that are getting struck, they have to think, well, we have U.S. bases. Are we also vulnerable to a missile attack? I think that must be in the back of their mind, especially after Iran launched this missile attack on Diego Garcia, kind of demonstrating that the range of its missiles exceeds what previously military analysts had supposed. So this is all very bad for NATO. I think it's bad for NATO in a way that critics of NATO should even be concerned about, because Trump wants it to be an aggressive alliance. And, I can't remember exactly what your question had been, but Trump can't withdraw from it, but he can definitely make it a hollow shell of its former self.
Mhm. Well, Mr. Andrew Day, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Today we were together with Mr. Andrew Day from American Conservative. I hope to see you again in new interviews. Peace out.